Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is One Thing You Missed. Right next to me is George Jones, an old vinyl album of George Jones, legendary country singer, songwriter. One of my staff members actually was saying not too long ago, I'm not quite sure who this is. And my response was to say, if you don't know who George Jones is, you probably shouldn't be working with me. So we corrected that. But I was thinking about Jones this week because of the song that he wrote that is classic, He Stopped Loving Her Today. And spoiler alert, if you don't know this song, you listen to it. It's about a man, everyone's saying he's all dressed up. He looks better than he has in years. He's smiling. He stopped loving her today. And then eventually you find out in the song, it's his funeral or his wake. And so he's dead. In other words, his love, he couldn't get over her as long as he was alive. And everyone's gathered around talking about him at his funeral. And I was thinking about that this week because there's a decreasing number of Americans who would even understand that logic because there are fewer and fewer people who are doing funerals the way that song would portray or the way that we typically think about in American culture. There was a really interesting study done by Axios this week that they put not only in their daily newsletter, but also on the program that they do, I believe on HBO. I haven't seen the program yet, but the article was fascinating because it was talking about all of these different aspects of death that are changing in American life. So you can look, for instance, at the skyrocketing rates of cremation as opposed to burial. And those track on the basis of religious affiliation. So the highest rates of cremation were in, I think, Oregon, a place with very low religious affiliation, very high number of people with no religious affiliation. The lowest rates of cremation were in my home state of Mississippi with a very high rate of religious affiliation. And so that's changing as America secularizes. Burial is not happening as much. Cremation is happening more. And even cremation is changing so that it's not just the sort of cremation we tend to think of in terms of ashes at the end, but I forget even the name of it, but the sort of water-based cremation that essentially just breaks the person's body down, and so you end up with a little vial of liquid rather than ashes. And they were talking about the phenomenon of at Disney World, for instance, having to have staff members that are constantly on guard to clean up human ashes that are left at Disney World because you have all of these people who are saying, I really want my final resting place to be at the happiest place on earth. And so somebody's sprinkling grandma at the It's a Small World ride and that sort of thing, which to me, any of my loved ones who see this, do not scatter anything of me on the It's a Small World ride or at Disney World at all. I can think of nothing more stressful than that. And I have perfect confidence as to where I'll end up. Even so, I don't want to be at Disney World, even in the body, even if in spirit I'm with the Lord. But in thinking about that, it was talking about how not only do you have all of these changes taking place, but you have something that I haven't encountered called death cafes, where people get together, they're talking about death because they need to work through it. And Axios reports that these death cafes aren't really the somber sort of thing that you might think they would be. Instead, it's people eating cake, so a lot of laughter, a lot of joking around, but talking about death. And either someone who's grieving the death of a loved one, maybe somebody who is sick and is looking at death being imminent, and they're trying to work through that. And I couldn't help but think in all of that these things are necessary because of a loss of something that Jesus has given to us in the church. When you realize the way that the Bible speaks of death, the Bible, gospel, answers all of these issues of death that we find all around us, both in terms of what Hebrews 2 would call the fear of death, through which the devil keeps people enslaved, that terror of death that will lead people to, for instance, some people to do anything to make sure that they get rid of any sign of aging, or that they deny even the reality of death at all. At the same time, the gospel makes sense of why death is so awful. Sometimes I will talk to atheists or agnostics who will say, I don't know why I dread death, because they say, I don't think there's anything after that. I don't think, as one famous religious skeptic put it, I'm not worried about death because I won't be there to experience it. And despite all the rationalizations of, well, death is just like being born. You don't think about what happened before you were born. You don't know what happens after you die. Still, that doesn't end that terror that comes about through death. Well, the gospel explains that too. So the gospel says death is not natural and not normal for human beings. Death is an enemy. And so we're right to grieve. We're right to lament. And yet, death is not the end. And so death doesn't end your little trip around, several trips around the sun, life, and then ends in an unaccountable sort of non-existence. No, your conscience is pointing you toward a day of judgment. Death also need not end in hopelessness and despair, because those who are joined to the life of Jesus Christ are given life, and that abundantly. And so the bad news that the Scripture gives to us, you are not going to escape death. Death it is appointed to man once to die, and after this comes the judgment, is quickly followed by the good news that says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. When we see people around us grappling with death, thinking about death, wanting to know how to even talk about it, then we ought to be the people who are able to speak a good word of good news from the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is Russell Moore, and this is One Thing You Missed.